In this video, we will show you how to replace your front brakes, pads, and rotors on this Honda Accord. This will be located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friends, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to do is safely raise and support the vehicle so the wheels are off the ground. Now once you have your wheel up off the ground, we're going to continue on to removing the wheel. To do that, you'll find that you have 4 19mm lug nuts and remove the hubcap at the same time. Now that we have the wheel off, the next thing that we need to do is pay attention to our 36mm axle nut. We'll be turning this counterclockwise to remove it. Use a hammer and punch to break the axle free from the wheel bearing located behind it. Now that we have movement from that area, we can continue on. Now the next thing we need to do is push back our caliper piston. To do that, we'll be starting up at the bleeder screw. Remove the protective cover. Use a 10mm to break this free. Once you see a steady trickle of fluid coming out, we'll continue on by pressing this back. Make sure you have a collection receptacle handy so you can recycle that fluid properly. Now typically I do put the collection receptacle on first, but I'm just going to open this up so you can have a close look at what's going to happen here. We'll use our 10mm, break this free. There's our fluid. We'll continue on with a small pry bar directly inside of the slot on the caliper, pressing up against that rotor. If it feels as though you have a hard time pushing this back, you may have an issue with either the caliper sliders or the caliper itself. We'll close this off. Set this aside. Now we'll continue on to removing our 2 caliper sliders. For these, we'll be using a 17mm. Loosen the first, leave it in there, and then we'll continue on by fully removing the second one. It's important to make sure that you fully inspect these caliper slider pins. If it looks like it's rotted and damaged, you need to go ahead and replace them. Let's get this out of here. Now once you do have that off, the next thing that you need to do is pay attention to the caliper piston and the boot. If you see fluid coming out of this area, that means that the internal seal on the caliper is bad and you should replace that caliper. This one looks fine, so we'll set it aside. We'll continue on to removing the brake pads from the area. These should slide out of place. If they don't slide out of place, you may have to drive them out with a hammer and chisel. There they are, friends. Continue on to your 2 caliper mounting bolts. We'll be using a 17 for these. Quick inspection, start that one back in. Remove the bracket, a quick inspection, and set it aside. Now let's follow the steering knuckle all the way up to the upper ball joint. we're going to have to remove this 15mm headed mounting nut. Once you have it off of there, start it back on a couple threads. We'll give the knuckle a couple taps with a hammer to break it free. At this point, you can take hold of the steering knuckle, pull it away from the vehicle. At the same time as you do that, you want to be pulling the axle away from the backside of the wheel bearing. Straighten this out a little bit. Now, we don't need to go too much further than that. We can have a look along the backside, and you're going to find the mounting bolts that hold the wheel bearing to the steering knuckle. To make it so we have a little bit more play in this area, we'll continue on to removing these two 10mm headed bolts that hold your brake flex hose to that steering knuckle. Now we have a clear look along the backside of the knuckle, we can start removing our four 12mm mounting bolts that hold the wheel bearing and rotor to that steering knuckle. Just start that back in a couple threads and continue on. Now we can start separating the bearing and the rotor from the steering knuckle. To do this, we can carefully tap on the mounting bolts along the backside here, gently driving it away. Go ahead and use some penetrant if necessary. We'll make sure we have the mounting bolt in here, a couple good threads. We don't want to cause any damage. Here we are. Got some movement now. Continue on to holding onto the rotor and the wheel bearing so it doesn't fall and potentially hurt you. Remove each of those mounting bolts. Now we can remove the rotor and the wheel bearing from the area and we'll bring it over to the bench. A quick note, when doing brakes on this vehicle, you have to remove the front wheel bearings to be able to remove the rotors. It's a good idea to have brand new wheel bearings handy just in case. Over on the bench, we'll have a look along the outside of the wheel bearing. You're going to find that you have four 14mm headed bolts that hold the wheel bearing hub to that brake rotor. We'll remove all four of those bolts and separate the two parts here. We'll use a rubber mallet to separate these two parts by gently tapping on the braking surface of the brake rotor. Looking along the backside, we'll turn the brake rotor as needed so we can remove this. There it is, friend. There we are. A quick inspection, we'll set this aside. Before we can install our brand new rotor, we need to pay attention to the wheel bearing. We have the mating surface where the rotor will sit against. You want to make sure you give it a good cleaning with a wire brush. After completing that, the next thing that you want to do is take hold of the bearing and try to give it a wiggle. We're trying to see if there's any movement here. If there is, you need to go ahead and replace the wheel bearing. All right, now it's time for installation. We'll be taking the wheel bearing and sliding it through the slot in the rotor from the front towards the rear. Now once you have that in place, we can lay this down on the bench and we'll continue on with our 14mm headed mounting bolts. start them in, snug them up, torque those to 40 foot-pounds. Let's get this back over to the vehicle. Let's pay attention to the steering knuckle port where the wheel bearing will sit and the splines of the axle itself. Go ahead and use a wire brush, clean them up, and give them a close inspection. Once it's cleaned and inspected, we'll continue on with some copper anti-seize in the port area here where the wheel bearing will sit and on the splined area of the axle where we had just cleaned. Use a glove finger to carefully spread this around. Coat those splines as well. With that area prepared, we'll continue on with the installation. Now we can slide the wheel bearing into place. When doing so, you want to pay attention to the orientation. Looking at the steering knuckle here, you can tell that these two forward mounting bolt holes are separated further than the rear two mounting bolt holes. If you are looking at that wheel bearing, you can see exactly the way that it needs to fit onto the steering knuckle. We'll align those mounting bolt holes and start in the mounting bolts from the back side. We'll get our bolts in here. Now that they're all started, we'll snug them up and then torque them to 33 foot-pounds. Now we can torque these down. Now we can pay attention to our caliper bracket. We'll remove each of our two caliper bracket tins. To remove the caliper bracket tins, we'll use a small prying device. Carefully make your way in between here and gently separate this. A quick inspection and set that aside. Do the same to the opposite side here. Now we can remove the caliper slider pin boots. Go ahead and take hold of that. You should be able to pull it away from the caliper bracket. Once you do have it off of there, you want to give it a close inspection. Make sure it's still soft and pliable, not torn, worn, or damaged. Now to clean these, you can use a rag, give it a small twist, slide it right on through the center of that boot. With that through there, we'll just continue on by working this around several times, trying to remove any of the debris that might be located on the inside of this. Once again, another inspection of this. That looks perfect. We'll set it aside, do the exact same thing to the other side. Once again, with the inspection here, we'll set it aside. Now we can continue on to cleaning up the bracket itself. To clean the caliper bracket, we want to focus on the two areas that had those caliper bracket tins. Use a wire brush or some sandpaper and clean up the mating surface. Confirm it's a smooth surface with no miscellaneous debris, and do the exact same thing on the other side of the bracket. Continue on to cleaning out each of your two caliper slider pin ports. We'll use some parts cleaner and a bore brush. A quick rinse and an inspection, same for the other side. Perfect. With the bracket fully cleaned, the next thing we'll do is start preparing it for installation. We'll be using some high temperature caliper lubricant along each of the 4 areas where those caliper tins will ride. This will help with vibration dampening and noise reduction overall. Now for the tins, if you were to look along the backside, you will find that you have 2 locking tabs that go along the center of the bracket. You just want to slide those right along the center and then press this in. Double check to make sure that's secured in place. Do the exact same thing on the opposite side. Continue on with your high temperature caliper lubricant. We're going to lubricate the inside of each of our 2 caliper slider ports. Some lubricant right in there. We'll also lubricate the pins when we do install them. We just want to have a little bit of pre-lubrication in here. Now we can install our caliper slider boots. Take that and just press it right in there. You want to make sure you work your way all the way around that so it's completely sealed. Give it a little wiggle to make sure it's in there. Do the same exact thing to the opposite one. Once again, pressing it in, give it a wiggle to make sure it's secured all the way around. Let's get this over to the vehicle. Take hold of the axle and your steering knuckle. We're going to start sliding those 2 together. Now, when you do have it pressed in together, continue on to sliding the upper ball joint stud through the upper portion of the knuckle. You may find that you have to use a pry bar to pull down on the upper control arm and hold it there. Now we'll snug that up and torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Resecure your flex hose. Now it's time for the caliper bracket. We'll slide this into position, start in each of our 2 mounting bolts. With those snug, we'll torque them to 80 foot-pounds. Now it's time to install our brake pads. When installing the brake pads, make sure you have them in the proper positioning so that the inboard pad has your wear indicator and the wear indicator is facing up. Slide them into position, give them a wiggle to make sure they are properly secured. You do want to have a little bit of movement in and out, but not necessarily have to tap it in with a hammer. Nice. Now it's time to use some high temperature caliper lubricant directly along the portion of the piston that hits directly up against the pads and the backside of each of these two ears. By adding lubricant in these areas, it'll help with vibration dampening and noise reduction. Now we can take this and put it in position. Make sure that the flex hose is not twisted. There we are. Now it's time for our two caliper slider pins. You want to make sure that they are well lubricated. We'll slide those directly into position here. Start them in by hand. Snug them up, torque them to 54 foot-pounds. Install your axle nut. We'll do this by hand. You never want to use an impact tool on this because you do not want to cause any damage to your wheel bearing. Once you do have this bottomed out, we'll get this down closer to the ground so we can torque it to 180 foot-pounds. To torque this to 180 foot-pounds, you may find that this will want to rotate on you. Now, if that's the case, you can have a second person inside the vehicle holding down the brake pedal. That'll prevent this from turning. Otherwise, you could use a pry bar diagonally down towards the ground. We'll come across these studs, being careful not to cause any damage. The next thing you need to do is pay attention to the axle shaft itself. You can see that it has a small notch carved out in it. We need to peen the axle nut into that area. That'll help lock it in so you're sure it will not loosen up on you while you're driving down the road. Continue on to making your way into the passenger compartment. Pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm, and then make your way back out here to your 10mm headed bleeder screw. Now that we have that pumped up, let's open this up and watch for fluid and air making its way out of here. If you see any air bubbles, you need to continue this process until you see a steady trickle of fluid only. Any air in the system will cause a braking issue. We're just watching along this area here. If you are touching brake fluid, make sure you're doing it with a gloved finger. That looks perfect. We'll close this off and clean our mess. If you have a bleeder screw cover, install that now. One last quick inspection in this area and we'll continue on with installing the wheel with that hubcap. When installing your hubcap, you want to pay attention to the port for your valve stem. Align it, slide it in place, and then you can start on all 4 of your lug nuts. At this point, we'll bottom them out, get the wheels safely back down on the ground, and we can torque these to 80 foot-pounds. With the wheel back on the ground, let's torque these to 80 foot-pounds in a crisscross manner. torqued. Okay friend, we've completed one side of the front brakes. The process for one side of the vehicle is the exact same thing as the other. Once you've completed that, you want to make sure you pump up the brake pedal till it's nice and firm and take your vehicle for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.